Several years ago now, a buddy of mine asked if I could house sit for him while he and his family went on a little vacation. He knew I was desperate for a little time in the countryside, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. I had only visited their place once before, and it was charming in an old, only slightly creepy way. I thought I was in for a nice few days to myself, just taking care of the animals and enjoying the scenery. But on the second day, things started to get weird. Initially, I thought it was just old house sounds, like floorboards creaking. But there were also the sounds of what I thought could be singing. But it was more likely to just be the wind whistling through the trees of the woods that started close to the house. I tried to just ignore it instead of scaring myself for no reason. I told myself it was best not to go looking for zebras when horses are more likely. But that second day made me realize something was truly weird about the house. I was relaxing on the couch with a book, having spent the morning tidying up the barn a little so it would be nice when the family returned. I started to hear the whistling or singing noise again. It started very faintly, so quiet I thought I was just imagining it. But then it got louder, and I realized it was coming from upstairs. And then I heard the sounds of someone walking around with heavy boots. As I listened, it seemed like it was concentrated around one area, like they were pacing or something. I put my book down, thinking I was going to go up and check out the noise, but by the time I reached the stairs, the noise faded to nothing. I waited to see if it would start back up again, but nothing happened, just silence. I was thoroughly creeped out. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on reading my book, but I kept pausing to listen for any more noises. Nothing else happened that day, but the next day, just a few hours before the family was supposed to come home, the source of the noises revealed itself. I was tidying the house and packing my things, focused on making sure everything was in order so they could just relax when they got home. The animals were all taken care of, hanging out in their pasture for the day and enjoying the sunshine. I could hear the horses trotting around the yard and the goats and chickens calling out to each other. It was a really enjoyable bit of background noise, kind of soothing for me after being so spooked the day before. In the middle of wiping down the counter, though, they stopped. There was no noise coming from them at all. I peeked out the window to make sure they were okay, and while none of them seemed injured or anything, the chickens were in their coop, and the horses and goats were staring straight at the house. None of them moved. It was like they all noticed something and were evaluating to see if it was going to mean trouble. Right then, I heard the singing, along with the pacing sounds from the other day. The hairs on my neck stood straight up, and I forced myself to turn away from the window and head towards the stairs. Whoever or whatever it was, I was going to catch it this time. I made it upstairs and listened so I could hear where the noise was coming from. It seemed like it was coming from the office, so I went over to the door and stopped, really not wanting to go in but knowing I had to. The voice was a woman's, youngish, and she was singing something that had a lullaby-like quality to it. I opened the door and saw her, faded like a projector image but definitely there. She was wearing very old clothing, with a long brown skirt with a faded blue apron and navy shirt buttoned up to the neck. She didn't look up or seem to see me at all. Then, like a TV screen fading to black, she just vanished. The family came back not long after. I decided not to tell them what I'd seen in case I was just somehow crazy. They never mentioned anything before or since, so if there was a spirit haunting their house, at least it wasn't bothering them. When my daughter was young, we lived in the countryside, far from the stress of the city my wife and I had met in and mutually despised. We had a little hobby farm with a big garden and a few animals. At first it had what we thought was a normal level of old farmhouse creepiness, like doors creaking open, bumps in the night that could just be the house settling or critters outside. But as time went on, creepier things started happening. First it started with things going missing. We realized one day we had no spoons in the house. They weren't in the dishwasher, they weren't being used for something, they were just in the drawer one day and gone the next. Our dog started turning up outside in the middle of the night, barking his head off. We don't have a doggy door, and when we'd go to let him back in, the doors had been locked the way we left them when we closed up at night, so we had no idea how he was getting out and why he couldn't get back in. I wondered if we had a carbon dioxide leak that was causing us to do things and not remember them, which I thought was the most likely explanation since the house was so old, but we got everything checked and nothing was wrong. I even put little pieces of tape on our bedroom doors at night, from the door to the frame, so if someone was sleepwalking, the tape would break, and we'd know who it was, but the pieces were always intact. I wondered if my daughter, who was only 5 at the time, was just up to some mischief and didn't want to own up to it. She didn't seem at all concerned or even interested when I'd ask her about it. But one day, when she was playing in her room, I heard her gasp as if something startled her, and then started talking like she was scolding someone. I went up to check on her, but all she would tell me was that her kitchen set was broken. I looked it over, but nothing actually seemed broken, so I pretended to crawl under the pretend sink and fix it for her. I guess I didn't do a good enough job because she didn't seem very pleased. Later that same day, I was in the real kitchen making dinner when the faucet turned on full force behind me. I turned to see if my wife had snuck into the room without me hearing, but no one was there. Then a bowl skittered across the counter like it had been slapped. I reached for the faucet to turn it off and felt a hard slap across my hand. I snatched my hand back, watching the spot turn red from the impact. I didn't know what to do, so I stood there in case anything else was going to happen. It did. One by one, all the cupboard doors started flying open. I had had it by that point and just ran out of the room. Instinctively, I went up to my daughter's room to make sure she wasn't being harassed like I was, but unfortunately she was. When I opened her door, she was holding one end of a stuffed cabbage that she used for playing pretend kitchen, tugging on it like someone else was holding the other end, but no one was there. The other end of the toy was clearly being held, but there was no visible person holding it. Thankfully, she was giggling like she was playing, and not scared by the fact that an unseen force was tugging on her stuffy. The dog, however, was going crazy, barking and running in and out of the room, nudging my daughter in the belly and trying to get her to move. The kid was delighted, thinking we were all having a great time. I decided not to spoil it and tried to distract her instead, and asked if she wanted to help me order pizza for dinner. She dropped her end of the fake vegetable and followed me downstairs, where we placed the call together. Afterwards, on a whim, I left a piece of pizza out on the counter, as some kind of offering, I guess. In the morning, it was gone, and I made a habit once a week or so to leave parts of our dinner out for whatever it was that was bothering us in our various kitchens. Things stopped going missing, and we stopped noticing anything unusual at all. When I was a kid, my family had an old hobby farm in the countryside. At first it was just home, nothing special about it. But as time went on, weird things started happening in the farmhouse. They started out only slightly strange, and not scary or harmful or anything, so I didn't really put it together at first. But then it became more obvious, and then it got scary. First it was doors seeming to open as I came up to them, but there was no one on the other side opening it for me. I thought it was the wind or some floorboard I had stepped on that moved the frame, but I could never recreate it when I tried. It seemed to happen at random. Then I started to notice that things I was looking for would suddenly appear in very obvious places if I mentioned I was looking for them. And by obvious, I don't mean that they were in the expected spot, and I had just not seen them. I mean like, I'd be looking for a book I'd left in the attic, and instead of being in the area where I was reading it, it would be propped up against the upstairs door the next time I went there. I was only about 10 when that started happening, so I assumed it was just my mom leaving it somewhere I would see it easily. Like I said, it all seemed normal at first, but around the time I was 12 or so, things would start happening when I was sleeping, especially when I was dreaming. I would wake up to see elements of things that were happening in my dreams happening, like if I dreamed about school, I'd wake up to find my textbooks open on top of the bed. I assumed I was sleepwalking or something. The worst of these experiences was when I was dreaming I was fighting someone at school and they pulled out a knife. Then the scene changed to my bedroom and I heard something clattered to the floor. I realized I was awake, and the thing that clattered to the floor was my Swiss Army knife I got from Boy Scouts, and the knife was folded part of the way open. I assumed again that I had opened it while sleepwalking and thrown it as I awoke, which was scary enough. What if I hurt myself or someone in my family? But when I went to pick it up to put it away, it was cold, while my hand was warm and sweaty. No way I could have just been holding it. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next night, I decided to do an experiment to see if I really was sleepwalking or if something else was going on. I got my family's video camera and set it up so it would record me sleeping, and I would check it in the morning until I saw what was causing the experiences. That night passed without incident, but when I checked the footage, I saw that the problem was much worse than I realized. Not only were things moving around seemingly of their own accord, but a few times I caught what looked like a fog or a mist surrounding the thing that was moving. My books would slide around on my desk, and my blankets would even be lifted up at the corners, and then the mist would swirl across the room or out of frame, before going to move something else. At one point, though, it stopped mid-frame, then swirled toward the camera until it took up the whole frame, blocking the view of everything else. Then the camera was turned off and recorded nothing else that night. These kinds of things happened for a few more years, but I remembered the times when things I was looking for would turn up for me if I mentioned them out loud. So one time I tried talking to whatever was messing with me, saying that it was okay to move my stuff around, but please leave anything sharp or dangerous alone, and please let me sleep through the night. These directions only backfired on me one time, when the fire alarm in the kitchen went off while I was sleeping and I was awoken by my little brother and realized earplugs had been put in my ears. Other than that, the being only rearranged my room and thankfully stayed away from the knives. So which of these 3 stories did you like the most? Make sure to like and subscribe for more spooky stories.